I'm glad to have this opportunity to speak to you men and women in the service of America. I believe in this world to come. I think it's going to be a pretty good world. But I've been asked to tell you about television, so I'll trim the philosophizing. Television is most certainly here to stay.
The history of media education, also known as media literacy in the United States, has been the chronicle of how to reconcile a strong political tradition based on a reverential respect for freedom of expression with a deep Puritanism rooted strongly in civil society. The North American model has been developed with tensions about its origins. Nevertheless, it has also been a model for other areas of pedagogical traditions in Europe and Latin America, continents which have been looking there at the media for reference and inspiration. The history of the media in the United States runs in parallel with the search for a national identity, the dialect established between individuals and the community, the problems that arise from the large dimensions of a country with an enormous cultural diversity, a nation whose government has always been aware of the value of the media, as well as its enormous capacity to influence the masses. Through this field of expertise, Kathleen Tyner has developed her career extensively. Tyner is a professor at the University of Texas. She is also the author of numerous books and articles, thanks to which, over the last few decades, she has ended up becoming one of the main American voices in the field of media literacy.
I grew up in a rural area, a small farming community, and I was always interested in working on the newspaper. I wanted to write, and I was always interested in the newspaper. And I would go to the newspaper, and they had what they called a lead press. So they had hot lead that they made into the typeface. And all of these men who worked on the hot lead press had burns on their arms and everything. And I would really annoy and talk to the reporters in this small rural regional newspaper. So to this day, I'm interested in local newspapers and local media. So when I went to school, and I continued to work on newspapers and things, and I got a teaching license. So it integrated my interest in media and news and teaching at a very early age.
The explosive emergence of radio and television in the United States was closely preceded by the appearance of the cinema. The authorities soon became aware of the power and ability to influence the population with these new forms of media. The social alarm that produced the possibility that the messages of some films were spreading around could end up corrupting the masses, especially the younger ones, led the government to approve the so-called Hays Code in the early 30s. The code determined what could be seen or not on movie screens, based on a strict moral criteria, censoring certain behaviors considered as indecent or harmful. The comic book code followed the steps of the Hays Code in the 50s. The comics were industry certified with an official stamp to show parents that the content was appropriate for their children to read. Later, with the advent of television to virtually every American household, an increasing number of researches were carried out in the 60s. The aim of those programs was that the children themselves could decipher the audio-visual messages that they were exposed to, and that they could make a responsible and critical use of the media that they were massively consuming.
There are three strategies: parental control, industry codes, and children's own autonomous decisions about media based on media literacy. As it went forward towards the internet and digital media, people began to see that it was very difficult to manage with just those strategies, And also, academia was coming in with things about critical thinking and thinking critically about the media and talking about the pleasure that people get in media, and not just these protectionist moral panics around new media. This still happens to this day, and media literacy is used as a strategy. But media literacy in the digital age, when people have a lot of individual control, is also used to help people understand not only how to reflect on their media use and how to think critically about mass media, but also how to produce their own media at the local level and to have their own voice and to bypass the major mass media to get their own voice out there into the public.
Throughout the 90s, the North American media education specialists began to pay attention to what they were doing in Canada. That trend opened a period marked by the exchange of experiences with other professionals, not just Canadians, but from all Anglo-Saxon countries, resulting in a remarkable open-mindedness and a significant enrichment of the local practices.
In the United States, when media education began to spread in the 1990s, we took the models from the Canadians, the Association for Media Literacy, who came up with some key concepts for analyzing media, like who produced it and why, what kind of media is it, how is it commercialized. We took these things and these models from the Canadians that were really important to shape media education in the United States. In addition, the British Film Institute and people like Len Masterman and David Buckingham and Carrie Bazalgette were really important as case studies that we could look at to help people organize the aims and purposes for media education, but also the practices in the classroom, because they already had experience. Finally, the Australians also contributed quite a lot. And the Australians were interested in aesthetics and art as well as the critical thinking about it.
For many years, experts in the United States have tried to create media education standards through which to show what contents are important in media literacy and how those contents should be taught. However, despite the effort to do this, they have not been able to reach any conclusions about the scope or the true value of these educational standards. It is also true that despite their importance, those standards may become insufficient in ensuring the integration of media education in the curriculum.
Traditional schooling is still very discipline-based. It's based on schedules from the last century where people go for an hour for everything. There is more of a push now for integration with after-school programs, especially for production. So production has always been a problem. Early in the 20th century, we started to have newspaper programs for children and for teenagers and especially. And so they made their own school newspaper. And they had after-school clubs and different kinds of affinity groups to make media. But when television and the porta-packs and the video came in the 60s, very few schools actually used video production. Sometimes, but it was uncommon. And it's an elective again, so it's marginalized. So where did this happen? Kids taught each other, and this is true with film clubs and hobbyists from the film era on. Kids taught each other in clubs or informal places. And there were a lot of nonprofit organizations who took this on as a way to give not only children but also adults a voice in a community access sort of paradigm where people came in and they made their own media and they put their own authentic voice.
I not be expect say they like that go change like so. They like that go be somebody like so.
Through various experiments carried out in different parts of the planet, Tyner concludes that at this point we should distinguish between media education and the merely technological education, which is a kind of education limited to teach the functioning of tools and technological devices that we use to generate an audio-visual message. Tyner also makes clear what she calls the tyranny of narrative. According to Tyner, when we critically analyse a message, we tend to focus on the content, leaving the form aside.
If you're a professional media maker, you know this. Oftentimes it's about the editing. So it's about the editing and the aesthetic choices as well. So what happens is, if I teach kids production, say they're making an animation or they're making an avatar in a virtual world, they get very frustrated because they haven't had a lot of experience with art education in their public schools, and as a result, they can't even render the human form with a pencil. So we're asking them to use this computer device to render an avatar when they can't even really do that with scale and color and choices that are aesthetic. So we need to scaffold it a little bit through art education for ways that we can take this into a digital world for production. And I believe once we do give people hands-on project-based work for production, then they can better understand mass media and the media produced by others. If we talk about the history of media in the United States, there are others who have tried to think about all the range of skills that it takes to be literate. Let's just call it literacy. An early one was the New London group, which involved people like Bill Cope and James Paul Gee and others who really tried to think about what it takes to design literacy for people. So I took this idea for my students when I tried to explain, and I made it into a mandala. And if you look for multiliteracy mandala on the web, you can find it. But the multiliteracy mandala was a way to try to understand the very complicated topic of literacy. And it starts with content in the middle of the mandala. And I don't know if you know what a mandala is, but a mandala is a way to think about the universe. Well, this is the universe of literacy. So you start with content, and what do you need to understand that? You need to know about the codes and conventions of that text and narrative. You need to know how it's produced. You need to know how it's distributed to you, and all the legal ramifications of it. But most importantly, I think most importantly, you need to understand the context in which it's received. So I made this mandala. All right. So the minute I made it, everybody argued with me. And they said, why is content in the middle? Why are audiences not in the middle? Why do you call it content? And so I made, for my students, I made a blank mandala. And I put it online so that they can make their own mandala. So it's important that you consider how you understand media.
The problem of media education in the United States connects with a larger one, the crisis of the educational institution as we know it, too anchored in a model based on repetition, a model in which the teacher is the center of the educational process and in which the value of educational experiences that take place beyond the classroom walls are rejected.
So schools are so traditional. Not only do they often ban the uses of personal media, and I call this personal media, your own cell phone or your own choices for the media that you like. They ban the personal media from schools. This is everyday culture for kids outside of the school walls. So the idea is to open this up to things like critical analysis and critical production. We have to tear down the walls between the formal and informal ways that people learn. And schooling is so traditional with the disciplines and the time frames and the seasons. People are learning these things outside the school walls. It's not that there aren't still things in the schools that are really, really important for the community and for citizens to learn. But there are other ways to learn that are also useful. And so if we could converge those informal practices with media education and the formal practices, that would be so interesting. And go more towards project-based work, less rigid schedules.
In response to this rigidity, Tyner goes on to say that current trends in media education in the United States are getting closer to the so-called do-it-yourself model, a way of creating inspired by alternative culture movements based on principles related to self-management, partnership, and cooperation.
I think this is a good model, and we see it with the do-it-yourself models around the country, and people making things, all kinds of things, and these affinity groups and the community that builds around this and the learning that happens. And it's very, very exciting. We also see it with youth media organizations. And one example is Educational Video Center in New York City. This is, I think, their 30th anniversary. And Educational Video Center started as a nonprofit for kids to make documentary. So they focus on documentary, and kids record their own authentic voice and make their own documentaries. Now, Educational Video Center is embedded in a public school in New York City. And so they bring the aesthetic, they bring the documentary production skills, but it goes on for all kinds of learning that takes place with project-based work in a school setting. And another example is in Chicago. It's called Convergence Academy. And Columbia Art School in Chicago partnered with public schools, and they made a design studio. So again, it's the built space where people can go. They can be more informal in their conversations. They have the equipment that they need to make media and to learn about science through technology, to learn about other things through technology. This came about in a number of ways. One of the co-directors is named Mindy Faber, had a youth media network in Chicago. And she did a lot of youth projects in an informal setting. One of them was really interesting. She worked with kids in Jamaica and students in Chicago, and online they made a video together called The Revolution Will Be Televised to riff on an old song by Gil Scott-Heron. But it's really interesting that the internet allowed these kids to collaborate at a distance. And so the built space is not only the architecture in the school setting or the design studio. The built space is also that space that can happen online for people to interact and create projects. So it's collaboration, project-based work, and problem solving at the core of this new vision for the way schools can break down the walls between learning in everyday life and learning in the school setting. People learn digital and media literacy skills from each other, and that's why the maker movement and the do-it-yourself movement really are important as emerging models for ways that people can learn these skills. They're already doing it, and they're doing it through fan culture and other ways. If you ever see vidders on YouTube who remix YouTube videos or television series, we see people making their own television series on YouTube, and some of them even get sponsorship. And so we see experts who come and talk about all kinds of subjects like makeup, or they talk about how to fix your plumbing. And so we see a lot of this work. This is where people are learning. And they also have access to distribute their work to a wider world, of course. And they can bypass major media outlets and the gatekeepers for journalism and for television and so on in the past. So this is really, really interesting time that we live in, to watch people take their own authentic voices, make their own media, and to experiment and innovate with not only the form and the content, but also the distribution of their own voice out there to a wider world.
Like Tyner, more and more professionals involved in media education around the world stand up for the elimination of the boundaries between different types of literacy. The key would be to strengthen the public school and turn it into a convergence point of different learning environments through which we travel thanks to information and communication technologies.
A couple of years ago, I went to the University of Toronto at a conference called The End of the Beginning of Media Literacy. And it's a perfect title because in the beginning of media literacy, people were trying to differentiate media literacy from other kinds of literacy. And in my mind, it's all literacy. Because the way that we communicate and the way that we use these communication tools and understand them are all about our own social capital and the way we navigate in a global world. And whether it's print or television or digital media, I think it's really important that we talk about literacy, simply literacy. So that's my goal, to work toward that in terms of the way we speak of it.